Okay, the next unit is exposure. This is unit 4, and our first vocabulary word we're going to be working with is exposure, and it's the measure of light, the amount of light in which a photograph was taken. So in this image here, you can see that we have an example of a normal exposure, an overexposure, and underexposure, and then this is one that's where it's blended. So we're going to be studying how we can affect exposure in your picture. If you've ever taken a picture and it came out too light or too dark, this is really going to help you understand why it's too light or too dark and what you can do to change that. So the exposure triangle is what a lot of photographers have been using to help them visualize how different aspects of photography will affect your exposure. So the exposure triangle is a tool used for beginning photographers and videographers to learn the balance between the 3 key players, which is aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. We learned all 3 of those in the last 2 units, so you're going to be well prepared to start to understand how to blend those together. I have an example of a exposure triangle that I like, and I'm going to bring this over for you to see. This one is nice and detailed, and I've provided it for you in Google Classroom. This one shows how ISO, aperture, and shutter speed all affect the exposure inside of the camera. So it also gives you a review of what you've been learning. For example, shutter speed, right? It lets in less light, okay, but it's more sharp, and it lets in more light, but it's going to blur the image. Okay, so, and it even gives you examples of shutter speed right here. On this side right here, you have ISO. You can start all the way down at 100 ISO. Okay, the light is less sensitive to light. Okay, so that means that you can be outside in a nice sunny day, and it makes it less sensitive to light so that you can have really nice fine grain. But when you go upwards with ISO, it gets grainer. You can see all the little dots in here. That means you're starting to lose some clarity. However, it makes it more sensitive to light, and you can go all the way up to ISO like 25,000 if you wanted to. And then on this left side here, we have aperture. And aperture, we learned, affects your depth of field. And the light, you have less light, but you have the ability to see lots of depth. And then you have more light over here, and you lose that ability to see a lot of depth. Okay, so as you can see, these 3 things affect depth of field, grain, and sharpness. Once you change one aspect in this triangle, it's going to affect the other 2 aspects as well. So you have to figure out the perfect balance to get your perfect exposure. We'll look into this a little bit closer. The next vocabulary word you need to understand is when is a picture underexposed. Okay, if it has not been exposed to enough light, then it will look dark. Okay, so this one is an image that has too little light. Not enough light was coming in. It could have been from any of these 3 reasons. Any of these 3 reasons could have been for that, why it's too dark. And as a photographer, you're going to have to figure out what you need to do to this to retake this picture so that it allows in more light. What are the 3 things you can do to add more light to this picture? Okay, so it's too dark. One thing you could do is you could bump up your ISO 1 stop, because it's really not too underexposed. Yeah, I would try to go maybe 1 stop. Okay, so if it's ISO 100 right now, you could put it to ISO 200. It would make it more sensitive to the light. The only thing is you would lose a little bit of your grain quality there. Okay, so that's one thing you could do. It all depends on what's important in your picture. Okay, if you don't really mind the grain quality, then putting the ISO up to 200 is just fine. But if you plan on photographing this and you want to put it onto a wall and you want it to be huge, you might not want any additional grain. So there might be something else you want to do to this picture. So what else could we do to this picture? All right, I need more light to come in. I could look at the shutter speed. Okay, right now, maybe my shutter speed is 1/8,000. Okay, as you can see, it does look like the camera has stopped the action of this windmill, unless it's actually just off right now, or there's no wind. So you have to determine on what rate that is moving, and would you lose any of your special effects if you decided to open up your shutter speed for longer. So I could move it down to stop to 1/4,000, and maybe that would be plenty of light to come in. So just changing your shutter speed alone could help. Your third option is to think about depth of field. Okay, so let's say you took this picture at f32, which is a very small aperture. You took this picture at f32, you could change it to f22, and that would open up that aperture one full stop and allow more light in. So when you're thinking about your photograph and how you compose your picture, it is essential to think about what is important in the picture. Is it the depth? Is it the shutter speed? Those are the two things that are the most important. And then you think about if you can sacrifice any of the grain quality. All right, so I'm going to go on to the next vocabulary word, and that's overexposed. An overexposed image is when you let in too much light into your camera. So here's an example of an overexposed photograph. The problem with overexposed photographs is you lose all these fine details right here. It's hard to concentrate on the picture because it doesn't feel right. It's not soothing to look at, and people won't want to look at it. So it's really important to make sure you get the best exposure possible. So in this image, if we use our exposure triangle, let's take a look again. How can we cut down on that light? Okay, so if our ISO was too high, that's the first thing I would do, is make it less sensitive light and bring it down to 100. If it was at 400, ISO 400, I would bring it down to like 100, or because this looks like about 2 stops overexposed. Honestly, it looks double like overexposed. So if it was at ISO 400, bring it down to ISO 100 and it would become less sensitive to light. So that's one way to fix it. Another way to fix it is maybe your shutter speed was way too slow. You can bump up that shutter speed and make it fast. It won't affect the composition of this picture in any kind of way to make that a faster shutter speed. It's not like you needed blur in this picture. Changing the shutter speed should be just fine. And now depth of field might be the most important part of this picture, because it looks like we have some images, some part of the image over here that is out of focus. So it looks like it's using a short depth of field. So that might be the one aspect of the triangle you don't want to change. So you might have to keep this off. If you wanted to cut down on the light, you need to cut down on the aperture. Remember, this is a larger aperture and you need to go down to a smaller aperture. Okay, the light meter. So this is a light meter that I actually used in college because this is a more exact light meter. You can actually, it has like a laser gun in it right here, and it shoots out a ray and it can read the light meter on a very small part of somebody's like shirt or on the side of their face. Okay, and you can look right through it and you can get exposure reading for it. Another way that you can get exposure reading is from reading from this bulb right here. So there's 2 ways to get it. When you are trying to expose in your camera, a lot of the times the exposure meter is reading the entire picture frame. So if this was your picture frame right here, the camera is reading the entire picture frame and it's averaging that entire space, and it's trying to figure out what is the medium or the exposure middle part. The thing about having a light meter on your camera. It's fantastic. It tells you how much light's coming in. However, it doesn't tell you what the best composition is. So if you think about it, if you're shooting towards a window, and you have somebody standing in front of the window, but you want to take a picture of the person. You don't want to take a picture of the window. The camera has no idea what you're trying to take a picture of, right? So the camera's trying to say, oh, look at that big bright window, that fantastic window. Let's take a picture of that fantastic window. I'm going to expose for that window. And you've all seen it before. And then the person standing in front turns out to be completely black and you can't see anything, any details in that person. So, your exposure meter is reading what's coming into the camera, but it doesn't necessarily know what you're trying to take a picture of. So exposure meters like this can be either internal, like in the camera, or it can be external, like this one right here. This one costs about $550. Okay, so what some photographers will do is they can bracket. Bracket is the process of shooting the exact same image with the same lighting, but you expose it differently. And sometimes I've done this when I'm getting a great shot and I don't know whether or not the darker image or the medium image or the lighter image is going to be the best. You can even set your cameras up to automatically take 3 pictures every single time, and it will automatically take an average picture and an overexposed image. So you're going to be able to have that capability on some of your nicer cameras. Or you can do this manually every single time. The only problem is it does waste a lot of space on your camera. I would only do this process if it was one of those situations where you just didn't want to go back to the studio, open up your pictures and find out you had overexposed it or underexposed it. So in this picture, it's a good example of perhaps this is a properly exposed image, right? This one looks like it has the best amount of lights and darks. However, this one ends up looking better. It's more dramatic. You can see more. So sometimes the most perfect picture for a shot is not always the one that is properly exposed in the middle. Sometimes a more dramatically underexposed one, or even sometimes even a overexposed one, ends up being better. So this is, as a photographer, you're going to find your place in what you think it makes a good shot. So we've talked about this before in every single unit. Stop. A stop is moving the ISO, shutter speed, or the aperture either up or down in order to expose your photograph under or over what the light meter says. Okay, so when your light meter, okay, when you're pointing your camera at an area and it's trying, if you had it in automatic mode, it was automatically try to get you to 0, which is where the light is balanced to what the camera believes is the correct exposure for your camera. And it is up to you if you think that it's telling you the wrong information, or that the light is different or the subject is different than what the camera is. You will have to move it up a stop or 2 or 3, or move it down a stop or 2 or 3. And in between here, you can see this is a fraction of a stop. I've talked about that before. If I say move a stop up, it means to go to 1. Okay, this would be like a third, and this would be 2/3, and this would be 1. So a full stop is when you go to the 1, and then to the 2 is a 2 stops, and this is 3 stops. So if I say you need to go 3 stops overexpose or 3 stops underexpose, that's what I want you to do, is to move your light meter over. And how do you move your light meter over? You've got to change either your ISO, your shutter speed, or your aperture. One of these 3 things is going to actually change your exposure setting. So there's 2 different bonus pictures you're going to be able to do for this assignment, and these are fun, but it also teaches you the concept of light metering. Okay, a silhouette. A silhouette is the dark shape or outline of something visible against a lighter background, especially in dim light. So this example right here is a perfect example of silhouette. You get a picture like this, I will be very impressed. So the camera is automatically exposing, or the photographer has set it to be exposed for the sky, because this If you took the character out of here, if you took him out of this picture, it would be a nice picture of the sky. But because the camera is pointing toward a really light background, it is putting this person into full silhouette right here. So you cannot see that person and who it is, which is kind of exciting and really a neat effect. You've probably seen this with a lot of sunset pictures as well. When you point the camera towards something really bright, you have something in the foreground that makes it really dark. So you're going to have the opportunity to try and create a silhouette. Some people do this accidentally and end up taking really bad photographs, but some people can do it for good reasons too. Finally, our last one is the double exposure. A lot of photographers have been using this trick for a while. It's recording 2 images or more. Sometimes you can do multiple images on top of one another. You can do it using film, or you can do it on paper for the old school way of doing photography. And in this course, I'm going to be teaching you how you can do it using digital photography. So as you can see here, there's 2 images. There's one of the guy facing us and then one of the guy facing to the right. So you would just pretty much take 2 different pictures on top of each other in one. It's called a double exposure. So those are the 9 words that we're studying for exposure. Let's go on to lesson number 2.